Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I'm Mario Theriger, and today I'm going to briefly touch on the subject of the representation of Thor and the swastika symbol on Saami drums. Mind you that I'm not going to greatly develop on these subjects in this video. The aim here is actually to take the opportunity to tell you about the importance of being updated and always taking into consideration new research and evidences. On a very recent video from February 2022, this year, I have made a video concerning the once assumed connection between Thor and the swastika. On that video I have explained that there was no connection between the Old Norse god Thor and the symbol of the swastika back in pre-Christian periods in Scandinavia, and that the symbol of the swastika only became associated with Thor to a certain extent in Iceland in the modern period. In fact, Thor's hammer, being represented as a swastika-shaped symbol, appears in Iceland on a post-medieval period. This modern association and iconographic representation led many scholars of the 19th and the 20th centuries to assume that the Old Norse pagan god Thor was associated with the swastika, and that the swastika itself was a representation of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. There's no point in repeating myself. On the previous video I have already explained why this assumption was made in the first place, and upon further investigation and new research coming up, we now know that the swastika wasn't associated with Thor in pre-Christian heathen periods or pagan periods of Nordic history, and it is in fact a post-modern association. However, and this is where I want to get, as some of you rightly pointed out back in a video of mine in 2018, a video concerning the Viking religious symbols, I was still pointing out this connection, an association between the Old Norse god Thor and the swastika. However, on my latest video this year, I have shown you evidences that there wasn't, in fact, any connection between Thor and the swastika in heathen times, nor during the Middle Ages. I think this is a very good moment and opportunity to express a lesson that may prove to be useful in life to all of us. So this is indeed a moment of learning. From 2018 to 2022, it's 4 years apart, and I have changed my mind upon further research concerning this specific factor. So I would like to express this so you can be aware of the importance of keeping ourselves updated and that upon finding new and better evidences, there's really no point in clinging on to obsolete ideas. It's perfectly normal to debunk and even contradict our own past research and even beliefs. Upon finding new evidences, more research, and coming to new conclusions that takes us closer to the truth as much as possible, there's really two things we can do. Either admit that we were wrong and show the new evidences and demonstrate why past claims were not right after all, or we can pretend it never happened and cling on to the wrong ideas for no good goddamn reason. So, let's see the part on that video from 4 years ago where I have said something that is no longer substantial and compatible, in my opinion, with new and better evidences I have demonstrated more recently. So, please. There are other evidences of this association between Thor, thunder, with the swastika. We have evidences of this symbol in Lapland, in the cult of Horagalles, also known as Horagalles, the Sami Finnish version of the thunder god. There were shamanic drums painted with swastikas. So there you have, back when I still used my old camera and zoomed in so much I looked like a bubblefish with a beard. Frightening. Well, I have changed my mind upon further research, as I've said. The video was made in 2018, but the research is older, and many things change in 4 or 5 years. This happens all the time, things being debunked, and even we ourselves ending up debunking our own past conclusions, because new evidences are always surfacing. In the meantime, myself and other researchers, of course, no longer see a concrete connection between Thor and the swastika. The swastika in Northern Europe came to replace other solar symbols such as the spiral and the Deities, among other symbols. In fact, by the Bronze Age, by the end of the Bronze Age in Scandinavia, we progressively see a decline in solar symbols. And then the swastika is introduced in Scandinavia during the Iron Age, during the Migration and Merovingian period, and becomes a substitute of sorts for solar symbols. Just the same way the Christian cross came to replace several solar symbols. I know I haven't yet made a video concerning the swastika specifically in Scandinavian history, but it's important to refer that the swastika itself, with the process of Christianization, was eventually incorporated into Christian religious iconography. So, more or less by the early 11th century in Scandinavia, the swastika continues to be understood as a solar symbol, but it's already presented within a Christian religious mentality, often either inserted in Christian religious compositions and motifs, such as its representation in rune stones within Christian crosses, quite visible actually, or the swastika being an element of decoration within Christian churches. So it stops being used within a pagan religious context, and instead it starts to be part of the Christian religious symbols in the north, a Christianization of pagan symbols, right? Not totally losing its solar connotations, mind you, because it begins to be a symbology representative of the resurrection of Christ. So it's still this idea of the sun and illumination in association with the sky and solar divinity. Now, the swastika in Saami Drums may have nothing to do with Thor, after all, the Old Norse god Thor, and was a later introduction of a symbol either possibly introduced through the contact with Old Norse people or through Nordic Christians, and remained representation of the sun or solar symbol, but we shall get to that in a moment. In the short take you have seen from my older video, I have stated that it is possible that the swastika was associated with Thor based on the evidences of the swastika in Sami Finnish drums. In one single example, actually, as we find at least one swastika in such an object. By the way, I say that this symbol is found in Lapland. I no longer refer to this geographical area as Lapland, as upon further contact with Sami people, I have come to realize that Lapland and Laps is highly derogatory. So I now refer to the area as Sapme and the people as the Sami. So, I say that there could be a connection here in the cult of Horagalles, also known as Thoragalles, the Sami Finnish version of the thunder god. However, upon further investigation, the swastika in Saami Drums, in one Saami Drum, doesn't appear to be specifically an iconography associated with Thor, specifically, and even though it has a swastika-like appearance to it, it doesn't seem to have been meant to represent the swastika, but rather another symbology in reference to the Sami deity, possibly Horagalles, which we shall see further ahead. In fact, the swastika-like symbol I am talking about is inserted in a set of pictures and motifs in a drum that also demonstrate Christian religious symbology as well, such as depictions of Christian churches, at least one Christian church. The swastika in a Sami drum can be found in the example of the 18th century drum from Thor in Norway, quite the late example, and in a particular period in Scandinavian history that marks a heavy Christianization of the Sami. Horagalles is found depicted in Saami Drums. The earliest ever found is from the 17th century, but never with a swastika, aside from the 18th century example we shall develop further ahead. And this particular example is important to take in mind because the swastika in question in this Saami drum is alongside depictions of Christian symbols and Christian churches, or what was thought to be Christian symbols, iconography, which could indicate that the swastika was probably introduced to the Sami by Nordic Christians, probably between the 13th and the 18th centuries of the Common Era. However, there's no evidences for that, no concrete evidences, and it's just a supposition or an hypothesis because we progressively see Scandinavian colonization of Sapmi since at least the 13th, actually the early 11th century, but all the way into the 19th century, with a special intensity during the Swedish colonization process between the 17th and the 18th centuries. So we are talking about periods in which the swastika was already understood as a Christian symbol of protection. As I've explained on the video about the Trojabo labyrinth motif, some symbols found in Sapmi territory that had been assumed to be symbols of pagan Sami origins were in fact introduced by Nordic Christian colonizers as both symbols of protection against heathen sorcery and witchcraft of the Sami, but also as pagan symbols now completely stripped of their pagan meanings, and now whose meanings were reshaped to fit into Christian mentality and thus used as symbols of colonization. And this could be indeed an hypothesis on how the swastika was introduced to the Sami, because the example of the swastika in a Sami drum is from the 18th century, alongside depictions of Christian churches and Christian motifs, and so indeed in a time period of an enormous and fervent colonization of Sami people. As such, the swastika here could be already interpreted or seen or presented as a Christian symbol. So we could be in the presence of the very Christianization of a Sami drum, not necessarily done by a Christian, but by the very Sami owner of the drum depicting a Christian symbol, the same way the drum owner depicted Christian churches as well. As I've already pointed out, the swastika in Northern Europe became a strong Christian symbol after at least the 11th century. And it is found in many Christian churches as well, and in rune stones and picture stones of Christian era, Christian period onwards, and with Christian religious iconography. So it became a strong solar symbol associated with the resurrection of Christ. So in Saami drums, the swastika could be actually a sign of Christianization of the Sami people and their material culture, and not an introduction in heathen periods that might have made a connection between Thor and or Horagalles. However, as plausible as this may seem, it isn't that easy, and there's actually another, and I think a better explanation for this. So, the once assumed connection between Thor and the swastika was also supported by the evidences of this particular Sami drum of the 18th century that represents a swastika-like symbol in association with a figure that represents the Sami deity Horagalles, probably. Horagalles, also known as Thoragalles. In the name of this deity, we understand that there's a sort of fusion here between the Old Norse god and the sky thunder god of the Sami, which we shall get to it in a moment. But first things first. It's important to point out that Sami drums don't just present motifs from Sami mythology and traditional folk beliefs and folklore in general, but also elements of the daily life of both the Sami as a collective ethnic group, but also specific individual daily activities of the very owner of each drum. as well as representations of several entities and personal entities like tutelary spirits of sorts, personal gods of the owner of the drum. Saami drums are absolutely fascinating, and each one is unique concerning several distinct representations, and they tell stories, collective stories and individual stories at the same time. This is important to refer because Saami drums also present regional understandings and beliefs concerning a variety of elements from myth and folklore, which means that in this specific case we are dealing with here today, the very Sami god of the sky and thunder is subject to regional changes, meaning that the same deity and aspects of that deity aren't always represented in the same way, in the same manner, visually. Sometimes the Sami thunder god can be represented as a reindeer, and we know for a fact that sometimes a whole male reindeer was sacrificed on special occasions to the god of thunder, burying the reindeer in the earth, and only the antlers would be seen standing out of the ground. So, sometimes in Saami drums, a male reindeer represents the thunder god in this sense of sacrifice to this very deity. Sometimes the thunder god of the Sami is represented as a particular building of sorts, some sort of construction, as a representation of a temple or a sacred space dedicated to the thunder god. Sometimes as the representation, I'll show you somewhere in here, of 17th, 18th century sacred Sami drum, where we see the representation of Thor, Horagalles, Thurguds. You get the point. Represented here specifically with his two hammers. Pay close attention at that. There's no swastika in this case. In fact, other than the other example, we don't see representations of swastika-shaped symbols linked to the thunder god of the Sami in Saami drums. Also, I take the opportunity to demonstrate something else. Still in this example, there's a human figure, I believe it's in the upper far right corner of the drum, which also bears a hammer, a human figure with a hammer. Not every figure that bears a hammer is Thor or Horagalles, as many deities bear some weapon or staff and other similar objects. This one in particular isn't a deity, but a human person, and a rune man, a Noaidi, a Sami shaman, right? As the correct term to address these specific members of the magical religious panorama of Sami society. Now, returning to Horagalles, the Sami sky and thunder god, depictions of this deity vary in Sami drums quite a lot, and it's subject to regional changes, as I've pointed out previously. We are face to face with a strong element of religious syncretism. It's actually not certain if it was the Old Norse god Thor that influenced the Sami Horagalles or vice versa. Both sceneries are correct, actually. Thor presents traits from the Sami Horagalles, just the same way Horagalles presents some of Thor's traits. Religious syncretism has ever been a strong social, political, and religious element within every historical society, community, and ethnic group. The very representation of the Old Norse god Thor in literature, in the sources, already presents several traits from many other pagan gods. The construction and evolution of deities follows the cultural elements that are appreciated and absorbed, and the greater the importance of a deity within a community or for a people, the likely it will be added to that deity important traits and associations of other deities from other societies and pantheons people come in contact with, augmenting the power and extending the, let's say, the fields of expertise of deities. Religious syncretism is a strong element of pagan and animistic societies, and it is a strong part of the basis of culture. So, in Sami shamanism, Horagalles, also known as Horagalles and Thoragalles, and often equated with Thieres or Ayeke, the latter being a grandfather or great-grandfather, sometimes appearing as Thor, Ayeke, grandfather Thor. All these terms are representative of the Sami thunder god. Of course, these names have been suggested to derive from that of the Old Norse god Thor, which is understandable given the cultural exchanges between different ethnic groups in Scandinavia, throughout Scandinavian history. This Sami deity also possesses a hammer just like Thor, two hammers actually. There are considerable regional variations in the names, and the ones that sound more like Thor, are typically from southern regions of Sami, closer to southern Scandinavian non-Finno-Ugric peoples. As we have seen previously, in the Saami drum, Horagalles is depicted with a sort of sledgehammer in one hand and a cross hammer in the other. And this is important to retain as we shall see further ahead. Both these hammers have a specific function of their own. With one, this deity creates thunder. With the other, it withdraws thunder, right? It seems that Horagalles is a direct translation of the Nordic Thursmannen, meaning the thunder man. The Sami word Horagalles is probably a newer name for the thunder god, as it is not referred to in old dictionaries of Sami languages. The similarities in sound with the god Thor, is precisely because Thor itself means thunder. So we have a series of etymological variations following the evolution of Nordic languages through time that mean the same thing. And Horagalles simply becomes a new term to say thunder god, but doesn't have to be specifically referring to the Old Norse god Thor. Even though there is clearly religious syncretism, the name Horagalles itself may simply be a term the Sami used in later periods to refer to their thunder god Thiermes or Hayeke. Galles is a combination of Northern Sami Galles and Swedish and Southern Sami Kalles. And both dialect words describe an old man. So it would basically be the old man thunder. Again, this is important to refer because even though there's religious syncretism, and Horagalles may present similarities with Thor and vice versa, the representation of Horagalles in drums doesn't have to specifically be also a representation of Thor, the Old Norse god Thor, but simply the thunder god of the Sami, referred to as the Old Man Thunder. So in the moment of the depiction of Horagalles in a drum by the Sami, it wasn't understood to be Thor, but rather understood as the Sami thunder god. And this is crucial to understand because other symbols that may represent or be in association with Horagalles doesn't mean that they are also symbols of the Old Norse god Thor, but simply symbols of the Sami thunder god, understood by the Sami as a completely different deity and not another representation or another name for Thor. Again, even though there is a clear religious syncretism in here, in the moment of religion expression from the part of the Sami, Horagalles is understood as a specific thunder deity that isn't Thor, but rather the Old Man Thunder. Also, it is important to remember that old Sami religion was founded on animistic worldview. Nature was considered life-giving, so nature's elements and prominent landscape features and fauna and flora were understood as persons of the world, as entities with whom a symbiotic relationship can be created if the human persons worshipped them and brought them sacrificial gifts. So we are not just in the presence of either a religious element and or a personification of an element of nature, in this case thunder, but also understood in the animistic sense as an actual person, the thunder person, which, just like any other person, it is subject to changes, moods, aspects, personality, which further expands the relationships between human persons and thunder persons, which gives way to more meanings and understandings within belief systems, leading to several different representations of thunder persons according to how they are understood, how they are interacted with, and how they interact with human persons, and their different aspects and what they represent or what they present as gift or as gifts to the humans under their different aspects. So we do have to take these factors into account: religious syncretism, language evolution, regional belief systems, and animistic relationships. So the likely scenario here is that Horagalles was subject to both religious and ultimately cultural syncretism, language variations and evolutions of various languages to describe the prominent aspects of a deity, but also understood as a specific thunder god, which in the animistic interaction with such a deity or a person, it wasn't understood as an interaction with the Old Norse god Thor, but with the specific thunder person known to the Sami. Such a thunder person that by itself changes even on a community level and individual level according to the interaction people have with this thunder person and the relationships they create with this thunder person. So, we return to that drum with a supposed swastika. The late 18th century shaman drum from Thorsenjer, Western Finnmark, Norway. We have an important figure which is the deity Horagalles. It has been understood as Horagalles based on similar depictions of other drums, similar motifs, but since this is so far north, Finnmark, it is probably Tiermes, a Sami god of thunder and rain, also called Haike or Haike, and often identified with Horagalles. So not understood as Thor, but as the old man thunder. Right above it, we have what seems to be a swastika-like symbol. The symbol in question follows the same depiction of the deity itself in that drum, but even more stylized. As said before, the Sami thunder god has two hammers. And that's exactly what we see here represented. Two hammers of the sky, rain, thunder, and rainbow deity of the Sami. Also connected with a sledge, by the way. It is as much as a representation of his arms and his head, as well as his two weapons, with which he controls thunder. A cultural syncretism here that influenced the Old Norse god Thor as much as the Old Norse god Thor influenced the Sami thunder god, but here depicted as was understood in Sami animistic religion, not as Thor, but as the sky and thunder deity. It's not a swastika, but the representation of the Sami old man thunder, the representation of the thunder person and or also his two hammers, his two weapons. Now, it is important to mention here that there are other elements here that led to the belief that this was a swastika, because here the depiction could have been an understanding of the swastika as a Christian solar symbol already, since this is a drum from the 18th century, quite late. In fact, the entire drum and its elements, when the drum was confiscated by Christian priests, the elements in it were understood in a Christian context, with a Christian perspective and religious mentality. This specific drum was first described by Knud Lim in his work about the Sami that was published in 1767, Knudlim was the second Christian missionary in Thorshamn, Finnmark, Norway. This drum, as many other Saami drums, were wrongly interpreted by Christians. You can see a variety of crosses in here that were interpreted as Christian crosses, and we see buildings with crosses as well that were also interpreted as Christian churches by the Christian priests. Yes, there's a Christian church there, or a cathedral, or what seems to be a Christian church, but these smaller crosses do not represent the Christian cross and or Christian churches or cathedrals. Take a special look at the three crosses in the center of the drum. They are not Christian crosses. They are the representations of the three Horagalles, or also known as Horagalles or Eilikis. These are important entities, deities, or important tutelary spirits of sorts, sometimes also understood as three Noaidi, rune men or Sami shamans. They are represented as sky entities of great power and importance, with which the Sami Noaidi contacts with, forms a relationship with, in order to carry on with what is necessary or demanded of the owner of the drum. It's the representation of three important entities in the life of the drum owner. Now, Johan Scheffer, another author, in his book The History of Lapland, in the second half of the 17th century, like many other authors of these periods of great colonization and Christianization of the Sami, refer to these entities as holy spirits and or angels. This is also an interpretation found in the other drum I have shown you, and please notice the similarities. You can see in the middle the representation of the sun, an actual Sami solar iconography or religious motif. The sun reaches all the realms and parts of the cosmology, and we see in both examples the same representation in the middle, accompanied by the three entities. In one, they are more stylized than in the other, but it is the same religious motif. It's understandable to a certain extent why they were referred to as angels by Christians. In one of the representations, we clearly see wings on them, but that's because it is a bird-like representation, and the wings representing their condition as sky deities around the sun, and they are important to be called upon in specific days of the week, each representing a different day, actually, different day of the week. If I'm not mistaken, from left to right, Saturday, Sunday, and Friday. So, we return to the drum in question with the swastika that isn't a swastika. We see the same representation, the sun in the middle, right, and the three deities. We have then the deity of the sky and thunder right above it, and right above that representation, the representation of his weapons. Right above it, we see a building that looks like a Christian church. And as a matter of fact, it was assumed to be a Christian church, but it's actually the representation of a pagan temple. In this case, a Sami pagan temple. Because the seemingly swastika motif in there is right above it, if you turn the drum upside down, it was assumed to also be linked to this supposed Christian church, and therefore, since it is also right above the building, this building, it was understood as a continuation of the solar motif. But that building is a Sami temple. Several authors have named these representations as both Christian churches as well as Christian cathedrals. The Christian priests that confiscated the Sami drums often interpreted the temples drawn on them, on these drums, as churches or cathedrals, due to the representation of crosses on such motifs. These interpretations have endured until quite recently, actually, unfortunately. But we also have to be careful with the term temple or pagan temple to refer to these motifs. It isn't Christian, but calling it a pagan temple can also be misleading and only used here to demonstrate that it isn't Christian, but it is a place of worship from the part of the Sami. This is a sacred place of worship, but it doesn't have to be a specific physical structure, a specific building that existed, but rather a representation on the drum of a sacred space for a deity worship within a garden and not a temple. But it looks like a temple because it is meant to represent a space, the limit of a space, of the sacred space, and an iconography, the cross, to represent a sky deity. And sometimes the representations, it represents fences to delimit the space of worship to the specific deity. Not much is known about temples that were related to the practice of the pre-Christian Sami religion, mind you. It is unlikely that the Sami temples were the same as the pagan temples of Old Norse people, the same temples on which the Nordic Christians since the medieval period have built their churches upon. And after the Lutheran Reformation, Nordic Christian colonizers have built their churches upon the Sami sacred grounds. So here we refer to these representations as pagan temples of the Sami just to affirm that these are not Christian churches, but it is unlikely that they were physical buildings. In fact, making comparisons with other Finnish Sami drums, we understand that some of these representations are meant to represent sacrificial stones, stones for sacrifice, places where sacrifice was made to deities and other spirits. What is important to retain here is that this is the representation of a sacred space of worship from the part of the Sami and not a Christian church. Therefore, no connection here between the swastika-like symbol as a possible solar symbol related to Christianity. Again, we have already seen that in both the representation of the Sami thunder person as well as his weapons, and not a solar symbol and not a swastika, but indeed a symbol representative of a sky deity nonetheless. In this case, connected to the old man thunder and his weapons, his two hammers. It is also important to mention that this idea that this was a swastika and related to Thor also comes from the same source previously spoken, Johannes Scheffer. In his book from the second half of the 17th century, The History of Lapland, he makes the comparison between the Sami thunder god Thiermes with Thor. And I quote, if you please. In the same place where they worship Thiermes, they worship the sun also, and upon the same table too, which makes me suspect that they were but one god, whom they called Thiermes. He simply assumed Thiermes and Thor to be the same and, perhaps most importantly, being the god worshipped in the same temple as they worship the sun, which is not correct. In his work, he speaks of the fire that exists in the sacred space related to Thiermes, the Sami god Thiermes. And so Johannes Scheffer automatically assumes that since fire is an element related to the sun in other mythologies, and that the thunder god he also associated with Thor is, therefore, a sun god, which neither of these two deities are. So this particular wrong assumption also led to conclude that in that drum that it was indeed a swastika as a solar symbol, because it was wrongly assumed that the Sami thunder god was related to the sun just because of the fire present in the sacred space to this deity, which, by the way, that is not represented in a drum, this fire. That fire being an element present in there as a source of sacrifice to the Sami thunder god. So, this is also important to refer that because of Johann Scheffer's wrong assumptions, It was assumed that the symbol was indeed a swastika as a solar symbol in relation to a solar deity, which it isn't. And it is also important to remember that the Christian priests that confiscated the Saami drums interpreted the Sami pagan temple as a Christian church or cathedral. Therefore, more evidences that it is indeed a swastika as a solar Christian symbol and in relation to that deity that was assumed to be the same as the Old Norse god Thor. In fact, it is quite possible that these early Scandinavian sources from the 17th and the 18th centuries of the Common Era are the very same, are the ones that also influenced Icelandic scholars of the 19th century and then led them to associate the swastika-shaped symbol with Thor's hammer. I've presented on the previous video. But now we know it is the representation of both the Sami, Old Man Thunder, deity, and his weapons, his two hammers, and not a swastika, and certainly not in a solar context in here. Because the swastika is almost always represented as a solar symbol in other mythologies, so an automatic connection was made in here. As you know it, in the Eurasian world, the swastika appears almost always in contexts that represent the sun. In Buddhism, it is a little bit different, surely, being a symbol of eternity. But in the Hellenic cultural world, the swastika was related to Helios, the personification of the sun in Greek mythology. In the Baltic world, the cultural world, it also represents the path of the sun in the celestial sphere. In ancient Persia, the swastika was known as the wagon of Mithra, Mithra being understood as a solar deity, which influenced the figure of Jesus Christ. So, as you can see, there were a lot of assumptions and at some points quite plausible until we find new and better evidences that completely refute this previous idea. So this is also a lesson to be taken here. The importance of also reading old and outdated works and compare the content with new evidences so we can understand why these misconceptions were created in the first place. Such misconceptions in this case are simply honest mistakes that sprout from early ignorance and prejudice towards the Sami. The more we delve into these subjects, the more we know, obviously. And there was never a lot of studies in relation to the cultures and belief systems of the Sami to begin with. Not until quite recently. So, things were simply assumed based on contexts completely outside the Sami cultural world and animistic religions, actually often dismissing an animistic understanding of belief systems as for far too long, unfortunately, for a very long time, a very long period, and animism was considered primitive and childish, and always studies not only very much under the Christian derogatory perspective, but also as well as the European colonizer mentality. So I think this particular subject serves to deliver many useful lessons today, especially in the way we always need to be impartial and truly seeking to know on a deeper level the cultures we are dealing with, and not simply assuming stuff based on prejudice and ignorance. Because this has a tremendous impact on future scientists and future research. Because even though future generations of scientists may not be racists, intolerant, and chauvinists and xenophobic, let's hope not, if they end up relying on older and outdated sources that are absolutely politically, religiously, and racially biased, the scientific work ends up being corrupted once again, and the corruption continues. So it really is important to know the earlier works because they also very much demonstrate the mentality of the people who wrote them. And it's important to compare the different ideas and evidences through time, not only to reach the truth and the better understanding as much as possible, but also to understand what led to these misconceptions and what was the mental process and structure that led people to commit these errors. So we can be more attentive and not fall into the same mistakes. Well then, this happens all the time. Upon further research, we end up finding new and better evidences that will eventually counter and contradict our own past research. That's how it works. That's how everything works. As long as we keep things updated and let the public know of our new research and evidences, it's a good sign, I think. There's no point in keeping up with obsolete ideas. Even if they made sense at the time, after finding new and better evidences, there's really no point in clinging on to something that now doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So, 4 or 5 years after the research I did for that other video back in early 2017, 2018, I've come to the conclusion, and other researchers as well, that the swastika isn't after all connected to Thor. As I've expressed on my latest video on February 2022, you can see right here at this information icon in your right upper corner, or at the very end of this video. So, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. Keep yourselves updated, always. And thank you very much for your time and patience. Tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje.